Good afternoon and welcome to today's FBA webinar, Law Student Series, Careers in Tax Law. My name is Laura and I will be your session organizer. Before I introduce you to our presenters, I have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to mention. Please feel free to use the question and answer box on the left-hand side of the screen to submit any questions. These will be addressed at the end of the presentation. A survey will appear at the end of the presentation. Please be sure to complete this. Now please welcome our moderator, Darren Gottlieb. Darren?
Thanks, Laura. Hi, my name is Darren Gottlieb, and I, along with Nikki Stentrover and Elizabeth Canier, will be moderating today. Before we start, I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists for joining us and I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce each of them. The Honorable Tamara W. Ashford is a judge on the United States Tax Court, having been appointed to that position by President Obama in 2014. Judge Ashford is the first African-American female judge on the United States Tax Court and second African-American judge on the court. She earned an AB in Public Policy Studies from Duke University, a JD from Vanderbilt University Law School, and an LLM in Taxation with an Honors Certificate of Specialization in International Tax from the University of Miami School of Law. Prior to her appointment to the United States Tax Court, Judge Ashford served in the Tax Division at the United States Department of Justice as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Appellate and Review, Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Policy and Planning, and Acting Assistant Attorney General. Under her leadership, she ensured the division continued exceptional success in carrying out its mission to enforce the nation's tax laws fully, fairly, and consistently in order to promote voluntary compliance with the tax laws, maintain public confidence in the integrity of the tax system, and promote the sound development of the law. During her tenure in the Tax Division, Judge Ashford was named a 2012 Person of the Year by tax analysts, marking the first time an individual from the Tax Division has been so named. Judge Ashford has also practiced law, focusing on federal tax controversy and litigation matters as counsel at Dewey & LaBeouf and as a senior associate at Miller & Chevalier. She also served as a senior advisor to the Commissioner, Large and Mid-Sized Business Division in the Internal Revenue Service, and in that position was the U.S. Director for the Joint International Tax Shelter Information Center, an organization created in 2004 by the IRS and the tax agencies of the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia to supplement the ongoing work of these tax administrations in identifying and curbing cross-border abusive tax avoidance transactions and schemes. Before serving as Senior Advisor and Director for the Joint International Tax Shelter Information Center, Judge Ashford served as Assistant to the IRS Commissioner, and before that practiced law as a trial attorney in the appellate section of the Department of Justice's Tax Division, and was a law clerk to the Honorable John C. Martin of the North Carolina Court of Appeals. George Callis is the Managing Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy at Steptoe & Johnson. He advises national and multinational corporations and partnerships on tax policy matters, particularly issues related to recent tax reform legislation. Prior to joining Steptoe, Mr. Callis acted as Senior Tax Counsel to Speaker Paul Ryan in the United States House of Representatives, where he was a lead House Republican staff negotiator on 3 major tax packages enacted into law. George also served for 7 years as Senior Tax Staff, including Chief Tax Counsel and Staff Director for the Subcommittee on Select Revenue Measures on the House Ways and Means Committee, where he worked closely with Chairman Dave Camp, Chairman Paul Ryan, and Chairman Kevin Brady. During his tenure as Chief Tax Counsel, George worked on the revenue aspects of several pieces of trade legislation. While working on the Hill, he also served as counsel to the United States House of Representatives Committee on the Budget and was Legislative Director and Senior Advisor to Senator George Voinovich. George received his BA, JD, and LLM in taxation from the University of Florida. Liz Chen is the VP of Global Tax and Chief Tax Counsel at the innovative blockchain software company Ripple Labs, where she is responsible for all aspects of taxation. She joined Ripple from General Electric, where she was the Global Tax Director and Senior International Tax Counsel for GE's industrial software business, GE Digital. Prior to GE, she served as a policy advisor at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where she worked on international tax reform relating to the digital economy in Action 1 of the OECD BEPS project. Liz is the former Asia-Pacific head of tax for Google and was a tax director at SoftBank Group International. Prior to Google, Liz was an attorney with Baker McKenzie in Palo Alto, California, where she advised technology companies on international tax planning and structuring. Liz received her bachelor's and master's degrees from Stanford University and her JD from the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. Danielle Rothfuss is a partner at KPMG and the International Tax Co-Lead in KPMG's Washington National Tax Office. Danielle advises clients on U.S. international tax matters, including tax planning with respect to their structures, operations, and transactions, as well as tax controversy. In particular, she has extensive experience advising on issues relating to international tax policy, tax treaties, foreign currency, sourcing, deferral planning, and foreign tax credits. Prior to joining KPMG, Danielle served in the Treasury Department's Office of Tax Policy. She joined Treasury in August 2011 as Deputy International Tax Counsel and served as International Tax Counsel from September 2012 through February 2017. Prior to joining the Treasury Department, Danielle was a partner at Ivins, Phillips & Barker, and before law school, she was an accountant at Procter & Gamble. Danielle is a frequent speaker and writer on a variety of international tax topics. She received her JD magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where she served as an editor of the Harvard Law Review. Danielle also received her LLM in taxation with distinction from Georgetown University Law Center and a BS degree in accountancy summa cum laude from Wright State University. A certified public accountant licensed in the District of Columbia, Danielle is the author of An Analysis of FIN 48, Accounting for Uncertain Income Tax Positions, and a gold medal winner for achieving the high score on the CPA exam in the state of Ohio. Thank you to our panelists again for joining us today, and we'll start with our first question for all of our panelists, which is to describe your career path. What brought you to your current position or why did you choose to pursue a career in tax law? And Judge Ashford, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Darren. And first of all, let me also just thank the FBA for inviting me to speak this afternoon. I always enjoy speaking to law students as well as to young attorneys who are interested in pursuing a career in tax. I wish I could see you all, but be that as it may, I cannot. Perhaps one of these days I can meet some of you in person via Zoom, or if you come to Washington, D.C., or if I'm out throughout the country, would love to meet you in person after this. But to answer your question, Darren, I will say you did a fantastic job initially in providing introductions and noting or outlining my career path to the court. But I will say this, as Darren mentioned, I have been on the tax court since late 2014. And so quite frankly, it was about 20 years in the making, I'd say, for me to ascend to the bench. I have had the unique perspective of handling a variety of tax issues from both sides, as Darren outlined. I have served in the private sector, with two different law firms in Washington, D.C., as Darren mentioned, Miller and Chevalier and Dewey and LaBeouf, and then as well as served in the public sector, most notably at the Department of Justice in the tax division. I also have spent some years, as Darren had mentioned, at the IRS. And I think a little bit later, we and my fellow panelists, we will get into the differences, of working at various public sector and private sector institutions and firms. But I will also say that it's funny, and looking back at my 20-plus year tax career, when I was in law school, I was not focused on the area of tax. I quite frankly, sort of stumbled, into tax. It was really a default. I went to Vanderbilt Law School, as Darren mentioned, and as it turned out, I took all of the tax classes that Vanderbilt offered, did well in them, enjoyed them. I graduated from Vanderbilt, and I decided to return to North Carolina to clerk for a judge of the North Carolina Court of Appeals. And then as my clerkship was ending, I thought to myself, wow, this was in the mid-1990s. What am I going to do now with my career? And I thought to myself, I really enjoy I enjoy tax in law school. I really enjoy, litigation, certainly appellate litigation. And I thought, for me, one of the ways for me to sort of, to demonstrate my, commitment to tax, that I really wanted to do tax as a career, was to get my LLM in tax. And so I ultimately did that at the University of Miami Law School. And then after that, quite frankly, that was the springboard for me to come to Washington, D.C. To start my career as what I like to say as a baby attorney in the appellate section of the tax division at the Department of Justice. George, do you want to pick up where I've left off? How did you choose a career in tax?
Sure. Thanks, Judge Ashford. So there's actually two plausible theories of the case for how and why of how I ended up in tax law, and one of them is genetics, and that is because as I once in a meeting on Capitol Hill told then IRS Commissioner Doug Schulman, I owe my existence to the IRS because my parents actually met at the IRS, both working there, and so it might be that it's just taxes in my blood, and that's how I ended up there. The other theory, which I think is actually the prevailing theory and the more likely one, is that tax law has actually been something more of a means to an end than an end in itself in my case, and that is because starting in high school, I became interested in public policy, and particularly in economic and fiscal policy, and the great policy and political debates of the day, and wanted to figure out a way from my home in Broward County, Florida, how to eventually get myself in the middle of those debates and legislative initiatives and multilateral negotiations, et cetera, et cetera. And when I was in law school at Florida, I gravitated towards the law courses that had more of an economic policy rationale behind them. So certainly tax, also antitrust law, bankruptcy law, IP, things like that, where the laws really are designed to help facilitate, or at least in theory, to help facilitate a fully functioning market economy and growth and innovation and things like that. So, I gravitated towards those kinds of courses in law school, and I was at the University of Florida. And the truth is, by the time I got to my third year, kind of looking out, Florida has a very good regional reputation in the Southeast, but not necessarily a international reputation. So if you want to go somewhere like Washington, D.C. and get in the middle of these discussions and efforts, then what Florida does have is a top tax LLM program that has a national and even global reach and recruiting opportunities. So I decided, because I liked the tax courses and really got into the sort of the economic policy and fiscal implications of tax legislation and regulatory guidance and changes to tax laws, that I would stick around for an extra year and get my LLM in tax, and then leverage that to be able to market myself more on a larger, at least national, if not international scale, and try to get where I wanted to go. And long story short, it worked. Darren went through my bio. I won't go through it again. The one thing he didn't mention was that my first job out of my LLM program was where Danielle is now, at KPMG's National Tax Office. and Washington, D.C., of course. And so I got to Washington out of Florida and started getting involved in those issues and spent 3 years in the private sector at KPMG before I got an opportunity to go to Capitol Hill, and went to Capitol Hill in 2003, as Darren mentioned, at the House Budget Committee to start. And throughout my time on Capitol Hill, when people would ask me how much longer do you plan to stay, my answer was pretty much always, I'll probably leave sometime in the next 2 years. And I ended up staying for 15 years. And throughout the 15 years, always saying within the next 2 years, I'll probably leave. But I continued to get great opportunities on the Hill to work on tax policy. The Ways and Means Committee was a phenomenal place to be, and I'll always love the committee as an institution. Got to work on tax legislation there, including tax reform under Chairman Dave Camp. Then later on had an opportunity to when Paul Ryan left the committee to become Speaker, to go with him from the committee to the Speaker's office, continue working on tax reform there, and really be in the middle of the negotiations that led to the TCJA. And so, with that, I had kind of achieved what I had intended to do and what the reason I had gone into tax law in the first place. And so about 2 years ago, I left and went to Steptoe and Johnson. And the great thing there is I continue to work on those issues. I'm just kind of on a different, because I'm essentially a tax lobbyist now. I just sort of on a different side of the conference table, not on the Hill anymore, but representing taxpayers in the same kinds of policy discussions that I worked on for so many years on the Hill. So it's a little bit over, and so as we say in the House of Representatives, yield the balance of that time, and I apologize for who I'm supposed to get off to next.
Great. Thank you, George. Liz, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks so much, Darren. And thanks to the FBA for having me. It's a real privilege to be here, especially amongst such an impressive panel. So I became a tax attorney completely by accident. In fact, I still am not sure, and I'm still sort of coming to terms whether this is sort of my life career or whether there'll be a further mid to late life pivot at some point. But when I was younger, I always thought I would be a technology entrepreneur because I had always been fascinated by new business models and how to solve problems using technology innovation. But when it came time to sort of look at grad school, and that time was primarily because the first tech bubble burst in the early 2000s, and having no job and having the economy in complete sort of disrepair, I looked at sort of going back to school to sort of ride out that recession. And there, I was sort of deciding whether to get an MBA or a JD. And being a child of immigrants, my parents essentially said, go for the degree that allows you to get a license, because then you'll have some job security. So in law school, so that's how I ended up in law school and not business school. And in law school, the tax courses were the only ones that really resonated with me. And I think, interestingly enough, sort of as I took more courses in tax, I realized that really understanding business and sort of business facts and business drivers was a key part of what made a good tax advisor, a tax attorney. I was also extremely interested in cross-border issues and international, and I'm probably one of the few people with a standing subscription to foreign policy for 20 years. So and I think surprisingly, tax allowed me to sort of combine that interest as well. I think one thing very few people realize is that international tax is one of the only areas of law that is fundamentally international in nature, because there's the transactions that you're sort of advising on and helping structure are by definition cross-border and typically involve more than 2 jurisdictions. And then I would also say that, in terms of sort of what brought me to where I am today, I sort of seeing it as a series of very fortunate sort of chance meetings. I ended up at Baker McKenzie, which is one of the world's sort of premier international tax practices. And I ended up there because I accepted a ride home from a law school event from an emeritus tax professor who connected me to one of his old students who was working at Baker at the time. And, having, sort of a great conversation from that connection, before I knew it, I had my resume on the hiring partner's desk as a third-year law student. And I was really fortunate to end up sort of at Baker as a first-year associate. And then from there, at the sort of, at my first firm event, even before I started there as formally as an associate, I just happened to sit at an empty, take an empty chair next to this, older gentleman, and we ended up having a great conversation and hitting it off. And he ended up, he was the firm's premier transfer pricing partner, and ended up putting me on almost all of his projects. And one of his clients was Google. So I started out my private practice at Baker with Google as a client, and I worked with Google for 5 years. And then when they were looking for somebody to start and lead their Asia Pacific tax function, I threw my hat in the ring and was considered because I was sort of a known quantity to them, even though they were looking for somebody with a lot more experience than I had at the time. So I would say it's really, how I ended up at the OECD. Again, I met somebody, I had a chance conversation, really hit it off with somebody, and was open to the opportunity when the question was asked of, whether I'd be interested in working on BEPS as an advisor. So I do think a lot of sort of where I am today is really because I felt like I was at the right place at the right time in many instances, but it was also just really being open to opportunities and also taking a genuine interest in the people. If I was sitting next to somebody or happened to have a chance conversation with somebody, just taking a genuine interest in who they were and what they were doing.
Great. Thank you very much, Liz. Danielle?
Thank you, Darren. I think, like my co-panelists, I did not go to law school thinking I would do tax. Although I am maybe the one with the accounting degree, that was also because my mother gave me the advice when I told her I wanted to be a history major with a long view of looking to law school. She suggested I instead do something where I could get a job. So I did end up liking accounting, in fact, but even with that, when I went into law school, I didn't connect going to law school to a career in tax at all in any way. It was fortuitous in the sense that when it came time to try to get a 1L job, it occurred to me the accounting degree set me up well to write a nice cover letter to try to get a tax job, and that worked. And so it was actually through not even so much my law school courses, but my summer job at a tax boutique where I ultimately went to, my 1L summer job, where I really described it as falling in love with tax. And I think my colleagues in that tax boutique, Ivins, Phillips & Barker, which is still around, it's a law firm that just does tax and employee benefits work. My colleagues told me, and then I heard it repeated over and over, tax lawyers are happy lawyers. And it became very apparent during that whole summer that the work I was doing, even as as Judge Ashford put it, a baby lawyer. I was just a summer associate. The work I was doing, and it was real work, it was the real work of the firm, was the reason I went to law school. I had not connected any of it to tax until that moment, but everything I was doing was research, arguing by analogy, and writing. It was the kind of stuff that sent me to law school. And I think when you're choosing a career, to think about what the actual work you will be doing, not what do those people do on TV, but what would be the actual work I might be doing for the next 10 years. And I have just been so pleased. I think my whole career has confirmed that experience as a summer associate, that as a tax lawyer, I was doing the real, art of argumentation stuff that was what had drove me to want to go to law school in the first place. There's very little, no is probably an overstatement, but very little overhead on my time where I'm doing things I would call busy work, or I have to do this to get that cool moment in court. It's all rich, intellectually extremely challenging. I think you'll find in many of the big firms, the tax lawyers actually work a little bit fewer hours than some of the other aspects of the firm, because honestly it's all pretty intellectually taxing. You can't do this stuff 20 hours a day, day after day. At least I can't. Nobody, I hope, is doing anything 20 hours a day, so I exaggerate. But I have enjoyed immensely my career in tax. So because of that summer associate experience, I did then go back and finish my 2L, 3L years at law school knowing I wanted to do tax. I went straight into that law firm I described, made partner there, so I was there about 9 years, and then I went to the Treasury Department where I was in the Office of Tax Policy leading the legal work at Treasury around international tax. So that included representing Treasury, at the OECD, getting to do some of that international policy diplomacy work. I got to write regulations instead of just interpret them, which just is a totally different hat. Like George, I told my husband when I went in I thought I'd be there 2 to 3 years. I ended up being there 5.5, so not quite as long as George, but it was because the work, I kept hitting a new challenge. There were so many different dimensions to it. I am sure that when I finish my career, I'll look back on it as, one of the biggest highlights of my career, that time in government. Coming out, instead of going, I pivoted to the opposite extreme because I had started my career in a tax boutique. I was lucky to be confident enough in my choice in tax that I could go to a tax-only firm. I know a lot of people aren't confident enough about that choice to go to a firm that just does tax, but I had come to that conclusion. When I came out, I, of course, at this point knew I was going to do tax, but I pivoted to big. So a difference, at KPMG, as I see, so many, I'm in the national tax function at KPMG, so I'm seeing so much variety, and it's really rich. But in addition, I think I'm just going to echo, I think my other panelists have said it all so well. I remember when I was in law school and I was telling the folks on Law Review and my moot court team that I was going to do tax, they looked at me and said, how could you choose something so narrow? And I'm so sure they had it so wrong. International tax is so broad. I mean, I go between I work on, steel companies I particularly spend a lot of time in Liz's corner of the world doing tech work. I love working on dynamic business models, where the strategy is always changing. The products are new and innovative. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out what this even is, from a characterization standpoint. So I work all the way across all industries. I'm not specialized in a particular industry, although I probably have a concentration in tech. And in international tax policy, it intersects with every other aspect of tax, the entire economy. I think, like George, although I would say my law school classes wouldn't necessarily have sent me in the direction of tax if I hadn't had the experience of the summer associate job. But I would say that I did gravitate towards the law school classes that had a little bit more of an economic business bent. I think con law is a little frustrating. It's not coherent, actually, as it turns out. I liked the classes that presented more of an economic system where you could kind of rationalize what the next rule ought to be. But I think maybe with that I should turn it back so we can march through the rest of our discourse.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle. This is Elizabeth Canyer. I'm one of the co-chairs for the FBA. Our next question goes to all four panelists, or looks like three panelists. Could you guys please describe some of the differences between working at the DOJ, IRS, Treasury, and the Hill? With that, could we start with Judge Ashford?
Sure, happy to start. Let me talk about the differences, or some of the differences between working at the Department of Justice, Tax Division, and the Internal Revenue Service, since my working background is with respect to those two institutions. So I will say this, in thinking about this question, it did occur to me, I know that there are, I think, law students on this call, maybe perhaps as well as young lawyers, and so I don't know if many of you have taken, or really have taken many or any tax classes, or certainly perhaps a tax procedure class. So in talking about the differences, let me start basic, and I always like to provide an example. I do this particularly also when talking about what I do at the tax court. How does the tax court fit into the federal system. So let me throw this out there. You file your federal income tax return and the IRS audits you. The IRS says you owe X dollars, whether it's $10 or $100 million, say based on your failure to substantiate your charitable contributions that you noted on your Schedule A. You have, the way our system is set up, you have the option to challenge the IRS's determination in two different venues. One is in the district court and one is in the tax court. If you choose the district court, or I will also say the Court of Federal Claims option, you are paying what the IRS says that you owe and are suing the IRS or the government for a refund. All of those cases, when you are in district court or the Court of Federal Claims, are handled by Department of Justice Tax Division attorneys. On the civil section, there are 6 different regional civil trial sections, as well as a Court of Federal Claims section, as I just mentioned. All of these sections are based, with the exception of, there's a section called Southwest, which is based in Texas, but all other sections, all of these civil tax attorneys are based here in Washington, D.C. So they are handling, for the most part, defensive civil litigation, arising under the internal revenue laws, as I said, in federal district court, as well as, I will say, in bankruptcy courts and in some state courts. They also do handle, so if you were a Department of Justice civil tax attorney, in addition to defensive litigation, you might also handle what's called affirmative or offensive civil tax litigation. You might have the responsibility of bringing suits to collect, unpaid tax assessments, or to foreclose on federal tax liens, or to determine the priority of liens, obtain judgments, to enforce IRS summons, and also establish tax claims in bankruptcy. So that's one route. If you're interested in doing tax litigation, civil tax litigation, the DOJ Tax Division is one great option. I will also say, because I think it does sort of get overlooked, is that in addition to the civil trial sections of the Department of Justice, the Tax Division, there also are 4 criminal tax sections, all of which are based in D.C., and they handle prosecuting individuals for tax evasion, money laundering, and the like. They work very closely with the U.S. Attorney's offices throughout the country. That's one side. Now let me go to tax court. So instead, back to my example, you want to challenge the IRS's determination in tax court. You don't have to pay what they say you owe. That's the beauty of the tax court. Instead, you file your petition or complaint with the filing fee, and you're in tax court. Now, on behalf of the government or the IRS chief counsel attorneys from all across the country represent the IRS in those disputes. Most of the time, most of the cases that I see are handled by attorneys, IRS Chief Counsel attorneys that are in what's called SBSE Division Counsel, the Small Business Self-Employed Division Counsel. There also are a few other division counsels. There's the large business, so some of the big like international tax cases that come before the tax court are probably handled by LB&I should say, attorneys. I will also say within IRS Chief Counsel, there's the national office. The national office is all in Washington, D.C., and national office attorneys don't actually litigate in the tax court, but instead they provide advice to the field or to division counsel attorneys. They also are primarily responsible for handling regulation projects, dealing with the priority guidance plan. So anytime, for example, if you see the IRS and the Department of Treasury, and Danielle can get into this a little bit, that when the IRS and the Department of Treasury puts out Treasury regulations or a revenue ruling or revenue procedure, IRS Chief Counsel attorneys in the national office, and they are broken down by subject matter. So there's corporate, there's international tax, there's income tax and accounting, procedure and administration. They will work on those. They also handle private letter rulings. So that's a different sort of type of tax career that one can pursue. For sure, if you also want to do litigation, then yes, IRS Chief Counsel, the division counsels are also a great way to start. I think, some would say, and I think it probably is the case, that IRS Chief Counsel overall is probably the largest, tax law firm in the country. So that's what I'll say on that. I think it's my understanding, I will just put a plug in, I guess, for both IRS Chief Counsel and the Department of Justice Tax Division. I think it's my understanding that just recently, maybe in the past week or two, the honors programs for these institutions have now opened up. And so these are great ways to get your foot in the door if you are about to graduate from law school or are very early, like 1 to 3 years in your tax career. If you're about to get your LLM, I think you are eligible to apply for the honors program of the Department of Justice Tax Division and also the IRS. George?
And I will say, I will add to that, if you are doing a clerkship, you can also apply to the honors program at Department of Justice. Sorry about that.
That's all right. No, so this is George. I'm actually learning myself from Judge Ashford today, so it's a great sort of double benefit for me here. So I've only, with regard to public service, I've only worked on the Hill and not in the executive branch at all. So I'll just talk about that briefly. I would say, number one, the biggest difference between working on the Hill and anywhere else is probably that in Congress you're actually enacting law, statutory law. And so the constraints on what you can do are generally political constraints, not legal constraints. The only legal constraint is the Constitution, whether something Congress is pursuing is unconstitutional. But if you clear that hurdle from a legal perspective, you can do anything. And I remember many meetings on the Hill over the years where, companies, taxpayers would come in. You'd have vice presidents of tax from major multinational corporations who maybe weren't happy about something, a loophole closer or some other revenue-raising provision that was going to hit their company that they didn't like, and they would come in and they would say, but we're allowed to do this. The regulations allow us to do this, to deduct this, or to have this kind of structure. Or the IRS, if it's transfer pricing, has given us an advanced pricing agreement, an APA blessing the amount of profit that we're booking in Bermuda, where there's no corporate income tax. So you can't do that because this has been blessed. And you get to look, you're on the Hill, you get to look at the VP of tax of a multinational corporation and say, but we're Congress, we make the law. We're not bound by guidance from the executive branch. We enact statutes. And so that's probably the biggest difference, is that when you're you're actually making the law, you're just not subject to the constraints, again, unless it's constitutional, of, regulatory guidance or court rulings, et cetera, et cetera. And you can really, I loved working on the Hill because it lets you be pretty creative in designing policy. The other big difference, and I won't go into too much detail on this, but the other big difference is that Congress is, unlike the agencies, and the IRS has its own rules regarding taxpayer confidentiality, but Congress is exempt from FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. And so you can do meetings, people can come in, taxpayers, and meet with you, and they can open up the books and they can show you proprietary information that informs you and informs your decision making and how to design policies in a way that they won't do with, for example, Treasury Office of Tax Policy, because if they give you proprietary information in writing, it might be subject to FOIA and it could become public information. So, couple of major differences between the Hill and the executive branch for people to think about. And with that, I will kick it over to Danielle, I believe, to talk about the executive branch side.
Do our hosts want me to do that? Because I'm not sure if I was specifically slated for this question. I'm happy to say.
Like you to do that. Thank you.
So I already mentioned that it was a highlight of my career to work in the Treasury Department. I think the Treasury Department, Office of Tax Policy, first of all, is a very small group relative to the size of IRS Chief Counsel. And that's true across the board, particularly IRS Chief Counsel. If I think about how many folks work at IRS Chief Counsel and International, I would think that might be in the hundreds or at least 100. Whereas in the Office of Tax Policy at Treasury, we were like 11 people covering kind of all of the different regulatory aspects that we were working on. So it's a little bit less narrow in that you're going to see more areas, but you're going to be a little less deep in the individual areas that you see in terms of writing rules. And I think just to put a pitch in for the experience of writing the rules as opposed to what I do now, which is trying to interpret and navigate the rules, when you're actually writing a rule, no matter how narrow it is, you really have to step back and understand the policy. Like George was saying, what rule is the most likely to further, an efficient economy and to not have tax having as least distortive effect as possible unless we mean to use tax as an incentive to drive particular behaviors. And, obviously not create loopholes. But if you're writing rules, you really have to step back and understand, like, the tax policy of a regime that was probably written decades ago, but, has evolved over time. And it may be that not every rule makes sense, but there is some overarching policy that I don't have to, I actually do when I'm interpreting the rules, try to interpret the rules through that lens. I think I have more of a bias towards doing that because of my experience in government, but that is certainly, like, the main lens through which you're looking at the rules when you're writing regs, and it is just deeply enjoyable to do that. A difference with the Treasury Department and the Chief Counsel at IRS is that at the Treasury Department, because you're probably more involved in policy in two respects, which is the administration puts out its own, they call it the budget, but sort of its own proposals for, changes to the tax laws, not regulations, but the laws that, of course, Congress has to enact. And in addition, like when I was there during the Obama administration, we put out our own sort of comprehensive tax reform proposal that included, a lot of detail around international tax rules. So I got to not just think about the policy of writing regs, but also how would we change the laws if we could change them. And then the Treasury Department, because I did international tax, we also negotiate tax treaties. So I got to negotiate, sort of on behalf of the United States with the U.S. flag behind me, tax treaties, and then other, that have to be ratified by the Senate, and then other, administrative agreements that didn't have to be ratified. But that was also just the richness of the different experiences that you can get in and out of government and tax. I hope that's coming through in this panel. I think it is. But that would be, and then representing the U.S. Treasury at I mentioned earlier, at the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, where, again, you're really, there in particular, you're really a diplomat trying to get the rest of the world to see international tax policy the way the U.S. thinks it should be seen, including taking into account, the perspectives of our largest companies and trying to make sure they're not double taxed or that other countries aren't taking more than their fair share of the tax revenues of our biggest companies. That's it.
Awesome. Can we pass it over to Liz?
Great. Thanks so much. So I didn't really have any experience with sort of the U.S. tax policy side. My policy experience has all been on the international side at the OECD and working in more of an intergovernmental setting. And so I think there, just to, contrast between the experience of working in sort of that public sector environment versus in-house at a company or in an advisory law firm practice. I will say the biggest part is, sort of in-house and working at a law firm, you can spend a bit of time thinking about the technical tax issue, as well as sort of the intersection between the technical tax issue and how do you operationalize something or meet business objectives in your tax advice. And I think the biggest difference at working sort of in an intergovernmental organization is that you sort of have to also consider the political impact as well, and really understand the political dynamics of what all the different countries involved in a project or an initiative, what are their own internal political dynamics, as well as the dynamics with each other, and then also what are some of the future power dynamics as well, right? I'm trying to think of the right way to describe it, but, the future power dynamics of which countries are expected to be influential, and you can sort of start seeing different geopolitical alliances form and so forth in that setting. And so in order to be really effective, sort of working within the Secretariat, where the Secretariat of the OECD is really stewarding the tax work and really being the ones to initially come up with the ideas in order to sort of be effective and successful in which ideas will survive, and to make sure that some of those ideas will also not be taken advantage of by specific countries who are trying to meet their domestic political objectives. You really have to understand all of these different political dynamics. And so that was particularly the case working on Action 1, which was the digital tax initiative, and thinking about, okay, well, how do you address these various countries' concerns around taxing these, super profits related to digital business models where a lot of services and goods could be delivered remotely, and but at the same time, sort of write guidance in a way that cannot be abused by either on both sides, right? Either by different governments or by the private sector. So it was actually sort of one of the most interesting and eye-opening roles I've ever had, as well as being one of the most difficult from the perspective of having to keep all those factors in mind in order to do my job well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If we can move on to our next question, which is to describe some of the differences between working at a law firm, in-house, and or at an accounting firm. And for this question, could we start with you, George?
Sure. So there's a lot of different things you could say. I mean, I've worked at both in a Big Four accounting firm and now at a law firm. Certainly a lot of major differences. So I'll just kind of pick what I consider to be maybe the biggest pro and con for each. With a Big Four accounting firm, in my experience, you're operating under far more constraints than you are at a law firm. I guess that would be kind of the con, in the sense that you've got the audit side, you've got SEC regulation, you've got Sarbanes-Oxley, you've got rules regarding doing things like tax advocacy for for audit clients. And so there are a lot of constraints because of the audit side, meaning the financial reporting side, not the tax side, that limit what you can do on the tax side, limit which taxpayers can become clients, and limit what you can say publicly. For example, I'm at a law firm now. I'm very active on social media, on writing pieces for Tax Notes and Law 360 and other publications. And there's very little control on me, on my content, frankly. With me at a law firm, I have a lot of freedom to say what I want. That's less true at a Big Four accounting firm, where you've got to be very careful about what you say. I co-authored an article in Tax Notes earlier this year with someone at a Big Four firm, and at Steptoe, it was sort of like, great, we look forward to reading it when it comes out. Whereas my co-author, we had to wait for it to go through several layers of review at the accounting firm before it could be approved. It had to be scrubbed and approved and edited and everything. So I guess that's sort of the one way in which I have found a law firm to be a little bit more liberating than an accounting firm. The flip side is, while you're more constrained than an accounting firm, I think you just have in tax far more deeper resources. Danielle was talking earlier about specialization versus being a generalist a little bit, and even the biggest global law firms just don't have the resources on tax expertise that a Big Four accounting firm has. At a Big Four accounting firm, there is a specialist somewhere in the global firm. There is a specialist on every little esoteric tax provision somewhere, most likely. And a law firm is just smaller by orders of magnitude, and so people have to be generalists. And there's not always somebody at a law firm where you can pick up the phone, a tax partner where you can pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I have encountered this weird thing. What's the answer?" and get a quick answer. Sometimes you actually have to do some work to figure out the answer. So it's kind of the law firm versus accounting firm thing, in my experience at least, is kind of freedom and flexibility versus the resources you have. And let me see, who is next here? I think we're going to Liz next on this.
Sure. Thanks, George. So I would say, George, I don't think you mentioned this, but for me, one of the biggest differences between working for a law firm, advisory practice versus in-house is that I no longer had to keep time, which until you no longer have to keep it, you don't realize how liberating it is to not have to keep your time anymore. So I would say that's probably one of the biggest sort of operational differences. But then other than that, I would say, it's again what George mentioned around becoming a specialist in a narrow technical tax area versus more of a generalist. And in-house, I do think people who really enjoy the in-house experience tend to be more big picture thinkers and project managers, because oftentimes in-house there are smaller teams, and so as a result, every person is working on sort of dozens of projects at once, and there's really not the luxury of being able to go deep and do research on each of those different areas. And so a lot of times you're essentially coordinating and working with external advisors, like accounting firms or law firms, in order to get to the right answer. And I would say that the one thing that being in-house, you're sort of expected to be the expert in is your company's facts, the business model, what the company's goals and objectives are, what are the main profit drivers, really understanding the technology and the IP and sort of the asset profile, and then being able to build relationships across the board, so that you're pulled in by the business, whether it's on an M&A deal or on partnership deals or just litigation settlements and so forth across all these different sort of company transactions, and you're pulled in early to take part in and advise on structuring and sort of what's the best way to get to the right outcome that's best for the company. So I think I'm going to pass it to, is it Danielle or Judge Ashford?
Can we go to Danielle?
I don't. Oh, Danielle, I'll just very quickly with one thought, just as a comparison between, say, law firm and DOJ/IRS. Being a litigator, a longtime litigator, and also dealing in tax controversy, I think one thing or a predominant thing that's very liberating about being, a litigator on behalf of the government, whether it's DOJ or IRS, is that you have your own docket of cases that you handle and are responsible for, and that is from day one. So I have to say, having now served on the bench for a little over 5 years, it is, in many instances, it is sort of wonderful and refreshing to see young, IRS attorneys, stepping up to the podium and, first year out of law school, first year having, graduated, gotten their LLM, and trying a case, on behalf of the government. That you would not get that experience or that opportunity, generally speaking, at a big law firm early on in your career.
Maybe the only thing to add, because I now sit in an accounting firm, even though I made partner while I was still in a law firm, I would say at the accounting firm, KPMG serves almost every company in some capacity. So when I want to know, and this is really echoing what George said, but when I want to know, how does the industry approach this novel tax question, I can figure that out fairly quickly and efficiently. And for me, that allows me to serve a very wide range of clients, in a responsible way. And that I'm also able, for certain clients, to really get into their facts, because I do enjoy practicing that way. I appreciated that aspect of a law firm, of being the trusted advisor and really getting into a client's details. And so I have, at least 2 clients where I do know where the business model is going, know how they think about their business model, and I'm just super into their specific facts. But there's also a whole, a lot, tens and tens and tens of other clients that I see their facts, and, I see them long enough to forget them the next day, but I'm able to give advice with the support of the whole organization.
Great, thank you so much. This is Nikki Stenshaver, and I am also one of the co-chairs for this event. I think given our time, I'm going to skip over one of our questions and combine our last 2, which is, what advice do you have for attorneys at the start of their career who are trying to figure out what path might be the best fit for them? And then also, given the current environment, how can they still make these meaningful connections and networks while having to, work from home or take classes online? And so I think we're going to start with Judge Ashford.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Nikki is actually my senior law clerk. I will put in, I'll give her a shout out. But so I do have a couple of pieces of advice. I know we are short on time, so I will kind of rattle them off, hopefully somewhat quickly. So one of the things I will say, particularly if you're a young attorney and you're in a law firm, I really would say it's time to be proactive. Certainly, volunteer for projects, make your interests known. That's my number one piece of advice. Second, I would say, this is to everyone, whether you're a law student or a recent graduate from law school or getting ready to go off and get your LLM. I would say I think it's particularly important, probably during this time of COVID, is that to attempt to get involved as much as possible, including getting involved in tax professional groups, such as ABA Tax Section, this organization, the FBA, or even not, and even I should say, non-legal groups, nonprofit groups. I throw that out there to say that So I have been a long time member of the Junior League of Northern Virginia, have served as the league's president, and I really have to say I owe a lot of some of my professional success to the Junior League. That's my second piece of advice. My third piece of advice, I think we've kind of talked about this. I mean, Liz has certainly mentioned it. For me, it has personally helped my career get me where I am now, is that the importance of establishing and maintaining a network. So seek out mentors, go to people for advice and support. And I think, now that we can't meet people in person, or it's very difficult to without practicing social distancing, I think it's just one has to be creative. It's just a different way of, so now we have these various video platforms, Zoom, a Zoom chat. I think, that can be helpful. Finally, I will say this, that I would say, don't be, this is more general advice, don't be so focused on narrowly focusing. I would say it's important to develop the broadest technical-based skill set early on. I think the broader your technical skills, the better prepared you will be. But I say that please recognize that I think although technical skills are important and, get you in the door, get you on the board, get you a seat at the table, also remember what I like to call, the so-called softer skills, project and time management, ability to think strategically, making decisions, working with others, being collaborative. I mean, you can get all those particularly those softer skills from getting involved in organizations like the FBA, the ABA, or, the Junior League, or any other type of non-profit organization. I will stop there. I don't know who's
Great,
next.
thank you so much. And I think George is next.
Okay, so first let me just second what Judge Ashford just said. Early in your career, if you go into tax, get that base of technical expertise. I can't reinforce that enough. Even if ultimately you want to go into a role that's less technical, if you want to go to Capitol Hill in a more political role, if you want to go into some role that's more of a management type role that requires you to be less technical, don't shirk on the technical expertise earlier in your career. Get that base, because it will be important to have. If you miss out on that early, you're basically playing catch up, after that, and you're at a disadvantage if you don't have it. So I appreciate Judge Ashford's comment on that. I think it's absolutely right. Another piece of advice I would give is to say, especially if you're going into tax law, tax policy, especially if you're kind of in the D.C. world, but even if you're outside of D.C. and you interact with the D.C. crowd a lot, remember, this is the piece of advice, remember that it's a small world that we live in. We live in a very small world where you're interacting with the same people again and again and again throughout your career, oftentimes in completely different roles, and oftentimes with flipped or reversed power relationships. The person over whom you have power and authority today, 10 years from now, you're going to run into them and they're going to be in a position of power. And they're going to remember how you treated them. So, there's lots of cliches you can use. Don't burn bridges. What goes around comes around. Treating people in this world well is not only the right thing to do morally, but it's in your long-term self-interest. One quick, I've got tons of stories on why that's true, but when I first started at KPMG, I was junior on the totem pole. I was right out of school. There was a very senior, very prominent partner who did a big favor for me, and I won't go into the details, but did a really big favor for me. And I was so impressed by it, and I couldn't believe he did it, because I thought to myself, gosh, why did he didn't have to do that for me. I'm nobody. This person, their career has been made, and they're a superstar and a celebrity in the tax world. And why did he do that favor for me? 5 years later, I'm on Capitol Hill, and that partner is bringing in a client to lobby me to try to get me to push for something in a piece of legislation that would benefit the client. And so in a sense, just in 5 years, the power relationship was reversed in that particular situation. And sort of, lesson learned. There you go. It's a small world, and if you go into tax, you're going to be dealing with the same group of people over and over again throughout your career, and so treat them well and treat them right. And so I'll stop there, and I think Liz is up next.
Great, thanks, George. So just I would say just a few sort of final thoughts, around how to sort of make the most of one's career. And I would say, early on, it's really important to not be shy, right? And to be open and to say yes often. And, and I think there it's, especially now with, sheltering in place and a lot of this remote working and so forth, be curious and be brave, right? And reaching out to people you don't know who you would like to get to know. And oftentimes, asking for an introduction if you have a shared connection on LinkedIn, or just doing sort of a blind email to them. I think more often than not, you'll be pleasantly surprised that people will respond to you, especially if you're early in your career and genuinely interested in having a conversation with that person. I would also say, beyond sort of becoming, really understanding sort of your area of tax that you decide to focus on, I think it's really important to also keep up to date on current events, as well as just read and learn broadly. And I have so many examples of times when, some, political or economic philosophy that I read, like in some random book or some other social psychology theory and so forth, that all of that sort of comes together in some tax-related project that I'm working on. And then I would also say that, it's important to sort of think about which area of tax that you decide to specialize in connection to where you want to be and what type of life experiences you want to have. So needless to say, if you end up in real estate or state and local, it becomes much more difficult to have those skills transferred to a career in tax, working in the Middle East or in London or in Asia. Whereas if you specialize in transfer pricing, that's an area of international tax that is very transferable. And so to also think about, other than sort of the specific tax area, do you at some point in your career want to do an offshore or an overseas rotation? And if you do, then you should probably look at an area of tax that allows you to easily do that. So I'll pass it on to Danielle.
And I won't take up too much time. I know we're already over because I think it's all been said so well already. In particular, just to echo Judge Ashford's comments about getting involved in organizations, I think what made my career was actually, I think it probably started, FBA was really essential to making my career, and that because the tax law is constantly changing, there are really a lot of tax organizations where young people can get involved in a prominent way, and often it means doing work. But eventually, if you put in the work, you can also get public speaking opportunities at tax conferences and things, maybe earlier than you might have been able to in other fields, because we do have so many tax conferences because the tax law is always changing. And those speaking opportunities is how I sort of got to be better known. It's how I would not have ended up at the Treasury if I hadn't started building a network, both around having my own little informal tax groups, but also taking advantage of all those tax speaking opportunities, even though I was scared to death, and taking advantage of all of those opportunities to be engaged in the broader tax community. On the Be Brave, I saw one of the questions that came in on the chat box, and I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to more of them, but somebody was asking about coming to Washington for interns. I had somebody come up to me at an FBA conference and say, I would really, that was a really impressive, the public speaking that you just did. I would love, you're at the Treasury Department. Do you ever take interns? And I was like, I don't know. Let me find out. And she was our first of a long series of interns. at the Treasury Department. So the Treasury Department hires interns, but probably never would have if that law student hadn't been brave and come up and started with a compliment by being nice, to George's point. Started with a lot of compliments, so she had me wrapped around her finger, and then an ask. So I think everybody else has covered all, and I could repeat all of the points that have been made, but I won't. Back to the FBA.
Great. Thank you, everybody, very much. Our panelists, Judge Ashford, George Callis, Danielle Rothfuss, and Liz Chen, thank you so much for taking the time today to chat with us, and thank you for everyone who attended. With that, since we're a little bit over, I think we can wrap it up, and look forward to seeing everyone in person soon.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our presenters and panelists and to all of our attendees. We invite you to join the next webinar in our Law Student Series, which will be on Monday, August 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern, talking about hidden jobs on Capitol Hill. Thank you, everyone.